I was 23 years old and I had $11 left in my checking account. Not 1,100, not 11,000, 11. I remember the number because I stared at it on my phone screen so many times. That week it burned itself into the backs of my eyelids like a scar. My rent was 6 days overdue. My landlord, a retired electrician named Gus, who smelled like menthol cigarettes and spoke in grunts, had taped a yellow notice to my apartment door that Tuesday morning. Final warning, 14 days to vacate. I peeled it off before any of my neighbors could see it and stuffed it into the bottom of my purse where it sat like a tumor I refused to acknowledge. My student loans were a living nightmare. I had graduated 18 months prior with a communications degree from a mid-tier state university that promised career placement and delivered nothing but a certificate in a cheap frame. The interest on those loans was compounding faster than I could calculate, and every month the minimum payment notification arrived in my inbox like a taunt from the universe. I was working a temporary assignment at a logistics company downtown, answering phones and filing invoices for $13 an hour, with no benefits and no guarantee that the contract would last past Friday. I spent my lunch breaks sitting in my car in the parking garage, not eating, because eating cost money I did not have. I would turn the engine off to save gas and sit in the silence doing arithmetic on the back of old receipts. If I drove only to work and back, I could make the gas last 9 more days. If I skipped breakfast and lunch entirely, I could stretch my groceries to the end of the month. If I sold my television and my winter boots on the internet marketplace, I might scrape together enough for half the rent. These were the calculations of survival, and I performed them with the cold precision of someone who had been poor long enough to know that hope was a luxury item. That Wednesday afternoon, I was standing in the office kitchen staring at the vending machine. It was one of those modern ones with the glass front and the spinning coils, and behind the glass was a granola bar that cost $1.75. I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. My stomach was a hollow ache that had graduated from discomfort into something closer to nausea. I was doing the math again. If I spent $1.75, I would have $9.25. That was not enough for anything. But $11 was also not enough for anything, so perhaps the difference did not matter. I did not realize I was crying until the tears hit the back of my hand. I wiped my face quickly and turned away from the machine, and that is when I saw him standing in the doorway. He was tall, over 6 feet, with silver hair combed neatly to the side and a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. I knew he was someone important because of the way the air in the room seemed to rearrange itself around him. People in cheap suits do not carry that kind of gravitational weight. I had seen him once before, stepping out of a black sedan in the executive parking area, but I did not know his name. He looked at me for a long moment, not with pity, which I had learned to recognize and despise, but with something else, something I mistook at the time for understanding. He walked over to the vending machine, swiped his card, and bought 2 granola bars. He placed one on the counter next to me without a word. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a white envelope, thick and heavy, and set it beside the granola bar. He said, and I will never forget the exact cadence of his voice, because it was low and smooth and carried the quiet authority of a man who had never once in his life been told no. He said, fix whatever is weighing on you. You are far too young to carry that kind of exhaustion on your face. Then he walked out. I stood there for a full minute before I opened the envelope. Inside were $500 bills, crisp, uncirculated, smelling faintly of expensive cologne. $500. I pressed the envelope against my chest and sobbed into it right there in the office kitchen, and I did not care who saw. I tried to return the money the next day. I asked around until I learned his name, Graham Aldrich, Executive Vice President of Operations, old money family. His grandfather had founded a shipping empire in the 1940s, and his father had diversified into real estate and private equity. Graham treated the corporate world like a gentleman's hobby, the kind of pursuit that kept him occupied between sailing trips and charity galas. I found his office on the 14th floor, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows and leather furniture that cost more than my annual salary. His assistant, a stern woman named Patricia, told me he was in a meeting. I left the envelope on her desk with a note that said, "Thank you, but I cannot accept this." By the end of the day, the envelope was back on my desk with a handwritten card tucked inside. "Consider it an advance on the bonus you will earn when I move you to a permanent position. Do not insult me by returning it again." Within 2 weeks, I was no longer a temp. Graham had spoken to the hiring director personally, and I was offered a full-time role in the operations department at a salary that was nearly double my temporary rate. I had health insurance for the first time since I aged out of my mother's plan. I had a desk with my name on a brass plate. I had business cards. Graham became my mentor. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, and he had the sort of paternal warmth that I had been starving for since my own father left when I was 12. He taught me how to navigate corporate politics, how to read a room before a meeting started, how to dress in a way that communicated competence without trying too hard. He bought me a leather portfolio for my birthday and inscribed it with my initials. He introduced me to clients as my protege and beamed with genuine pride when I closed my first independent account. For 6 months, I believed I had been rescued. I believed that the universe, after years of grinding indifference, had finally sent me someone who cared. I was wrong. The universe had not sent me a savior. It had sent me a trap disguised as one. The shift was so gradual that I did not notice it until the walls had already closed in. It began with proximity. Graham always seemed to know where I was. If I went to the restroom, he would be standing near the copy machine when I returned, casual as a cat sunning itself on a windowsill. "You were gone a while," he would say with a smile that showed too many teeth. "Everything all right?" If I took my lunch outside the building, he would text me asking where I had gone. Not demanding, not angry, just curious. Always just curious. Then the gifts intensified. The granola bar and the envelope had been the appetizer. Now it was a winter coat, because he said my old one looked threadbare and it reflected poorly on the department. A new phone, because he said my cracked screen was unprofessional. A pair of designer heels, because he said the shoes I wore to a board meeting were distracting in the wrong way. I tried to refuse each one. I tried to explain that I was uncomfortable, that the generosity was unnecessary, that I could buy my own things now that I had a real salary. But he never gave me the chance to say no. He would leave the items on my desk while I was away, boxed and wrapped, with no note. Returning them would have required a confrontation, and I was not yet ready for that. The turning point came on a Thursday in November. He called me into his office and closed the door. On his desk was my personnel file, open to the page that listed my home address. He did not look up when he spoke. "I see you are still living on Marsh Street. That neighborhood has had 3 break-ins this quarter alone. I have a rental property in Edgewater Heights, a 2-bedroom with a balcony and a doorman. It is empty and I want you to move into it. No rent." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I said I was fine where I was. I said I appreciated his concern, but I was comfortable. I said thank you, but no. He looked up at me then, and for the first time I saw something behind his eyes that was not warmth. It was ownership. Cold, calculating, proprietary ownership, the way a collector looks at a painting he has already paid for, but is not yet hung on his wall. "I am trying to help you, Elise," he said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but the temperature of the room dropped by 10 degrees. "Do not make me feel like my generosity has been wasted." I walked out of his office on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and I knew with a certainty that sat in my gut like a stone that everything I had believed about Graham Aldrich was a carefully constructed fiction. The money, the job, the mentorship, the gifts, None of it was generosity. It was investment, and he expected a return. I began pulling away. I stopped going to lunch with him. I kept my office door open at all times and positioned my desk so that I could see anyone approaching from the hallway. I responded to his texts with one-word answers and let his calls go to voicemail. I thought if I created enough distance, he would lose interest and move on to someone else. Instead, he got closer. He started waiting for me in the parking garage every evening. He would lean against the driver's side door of my car with his arms crossed, blocking my entry. And when I approached, he would straighten up and smile and ask how my day had been, as though this were perfectly normal. The first time it happened, I laughed nervously and asked him to move. The second time, I did not laugh. The third time, I walked back into the building and waited an hour before going to my car, and he was still there, patient as a monument, checking his watch without any urgency whatsoever. "You owe me, Elise," he said one evening, not shouting, not threatening, stating a fact the way you might tell someone the time. "I made you. You were nothing before I reached down and pulled you out of that life. Everything you have is because of me. Everything." I went to Human Resources the following morning. I sat in the office of the HR director, a woman named Sandra with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and I told her everything. The gifts, the tracking, the parking garage, the late-night texts that had recently started arriving. Sandra listened with an expression that started as concern and gradually settled into something more administrative. She closed her notebook and took off her glasses and said, "Elise, Graham Aldrich has been with this company for 31 years. His family endowed the training center. His mother sits on the board of directors. What you are describing sounds like a mentorship that has perhaps become a bit too enthusiastic. Have you considered that he may simply be lonely? A man his age, recently divorced, it is understandable. My advice would be to set gentle boundaries and avoid escalating this into something it does not need to become." I left Sandra's office, knowing that no one in that building would protect me. The institution had made its choice, and it had chosen the man whose name was on the donation plaque in the lobby. I submitted my resignation the next day. 2 weeks' notice. I cleaned out my desk, returned the leather portfolio and the business cards and every gift I could find, and on my last day I walked out the front door and did not look back. I blocked Graham's number, his email, and every social media account I could find. I changed the locks on my apartment. I told myself it was over. It was not over. 12 days after I left the company, I came home from a job interview to find a black Mercedes parked directly across the street from my building. I recognized the license plate. It was his. He was sitting in the driver's seat with the window down, and when he saw me, he raised his hand in a small wave, casual and friendly, as though we had run into each other at a coffee shop. I called the police from inside my apartment. 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later. They spoke to Graham for perhaps 5 minutes, then came to my door. The younger one, barely older than me, looked bored. "Ma'am, the gentleman says he was resting between appointments. He is parked on a public street. There is no law against sitting in your car." I told him he was stalking me. I told him about the gifts and the parking garage and the texts in the personnel file. The officer wrote nothing down. He said, "If he trespasses on your property or makes a direct threat, give us a call." Graham sat in that car for 4 more hours. Then he drove away. He came back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Sometimes he would get out of the car and stand on the sidewalk, perfectly still, facing my building. He never knocked. He never shouted. He never crossed the property line. He just stood there in his expensive suit with his hands clasped in front of him, watching my windows like a man admiring a painting in a gallery. I stopped sleeping. I pushed my dresser against my bedroom door every night and wedged a chair under the handle. I kept a kitchen knife on my nightstand and my phone in my hand at all times. 3 weeks after the stalking began, I woke up at 2:30 in the morning to the sound of rain hammering against the windows. I crept to the living room and peered through the curtains. The street was empty. No Mercedes. No silhouette on the sidewalk. For the first time in weeks, I felt something unclench in my chest. Maybe it was over. Maybe he had finally gotten bored. I went to the kitchen for water. I did not turn on the light because I had trained myself to move through my apartment in darkness, reducing my visibility from outside. I filled a glass from the tap and raised it to my lips, and that is when I heard it, a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. The soft, deliberate click of the latch on my back door, the one that led from the utility closet to the fire escape, the one I had forgotten to deadbolt because the landlord had never given me a key for it. I set the glass down on the counter with a trembling hand and listened. Footsteps. Slow, wet footsteps on the linoleum. Someone was inside my apartment. I did not scream. I did not run for the front door because a part of my brain, the part that had been keeping me alive for weeks, whispered that he might have someone waiting for me there. Instead, I dropped to the floor and crawled. I pulled myself across the kitchen tile on my elbows and knees, moving toward the narrow gap between the refrigerator and the wall. The space was no more than 18 inches wide and thick with dust. I wedged myself into it, drew my knees to my chest, and pressed both hands over my mouth. He moved through my apartment with the unhurried ease of a man walking through his own home. He was humming, a low, tuneless melody that vibrated through the walls of my small apartment like the purr of some enormous predator. He walked into the living room, and I heard him speak, and his voice was bright and conversational, the voice of a man greeting a colleague at a conference. "Elise, I know you are awake. I saw the kitchen light from outside." I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. I dialed 911, but I could not speak. I tapped the screen 3 times and left the line open and prayed that the dispatcher could hear something, anything, that would bring help. He opened doors, the bathroom, the coat closet, the bedroom, where I heard the sound of wood splintering as he kicked through the barricade I had built with my dresser. He returned to the hallway, and his voice had changed. The brightness was gone, replaced by something flat and irritated, the voice of a man whose dinner reservation has been given away. "You are making this difficult, Elise. You are making this so much more difficult than it needs to be." His footsteps moved toward the kitchen. I saw his shadow stretch across the tile floor, elongated and monstrous in the faint light from the street. He stopped directly in front of the refrigerator, 5 feet from where I was hiding, maybe less. He stopped humming. He stood in absolute silence, listening, and I could feel his attention sweeping the room like a searchlight. I did not see the police lights. I felt them. The kitchen erupted in alternating bursts of blue and red, painting the walls in carnival colors. The officers had killed their sirens a block away and approached on foot. Graham turned toward the window and watched the lights without any visible alarm. He did not run. He straightened the knot of his tie with both hands, a gesture so casual and precise that it made my blood freeze. The back door crashed open. "Show us your hands. On the ground now." I stayed hidden. I heard shouting, the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor, the metallic rattle of handcuffs. A female officer found me wedged behind the refrigerator, shaking so violently that she had to help me stand. "It is over," she said. "We have him." They were leading Graham through the kitchen toward the back door when he turned his head and looked at me. He did not look angry. He did not look deranged. He looked disappointed, the way a father looks at a child who has broken an expensive vase, as though I had ruined something beautiful. The second officer was standing near the kitchen counter, pulling on latex gloves. He was looking at something on the floor near the back door, a black duffel bag that Graham had dropped when the police entered. The officer unzipped it a few inches and shined his flashlight inside and went very still. He turned to me, and his face had changed. "Do not look at this, ma'am." I looked. Of course I looked. Through the narrow opening of the bag, I saw a coil of heavy-duty rope, the kind used for boating, a roll of silver duct tape, a box cutter, a package of industrial-strength garbage bags, the clear kind, the ones rated to hold 200 pounds, and beneath all of it, folded neatly, a plastic tarp. He had not come to talk. He had not come to persuade. He had come to end this on his terms, and those terms included a plan for what came after. Graham Aldrich was charged with breaking and entering, criminal stalking, and possession of burglary tools. His family retained a legal team that could have staffed a small firm, and after 14 months of motions and continuances and character witnesses in tailored suits, he received a suspended sentence with 3 years of probation and a restraining order. He never spent a single night in a state facility. His family's attorney released a statement calling the incident a misunderstanding born of genuine concern for a former employee's well-being. I moved to a different state. I changed my phone number, my email address, and the spelling of my last name. I do not use social media. I do not park in garages. I check the locks on every door and window in my apartment twice before I go to sleep, and I sleep with the lights on because the dark has never felt safe again. I have not seen Graham Aldrich since that night in the kitchen, but I know he is out there, and I know that men like him do not stop. They simply wait. I have worked in customer service long enough to know that the most dangerous people are not the ones who scream at you across a counter. Those people burn hot and fast and forget your face before they reach the parking lot. The dangerous ones are quiet. They simmer. They memorize the layout of the room and the schedule of every person in it, and when they finally move, it is with a precision that tells you they have been rehearsing this moment for a very long time. I learned this lesson the hard way, in a coffee shop, from a woman whose name I will call Diane. I had been with the company for almost 2 years. I started as a barista at a location near the university, one of those perpetually understaffed stores where you learn to make 4 drinks simultaneously while explaining to an angry sophomore that the oat milk costs extra. I was good at the job, genuinely good, and after 18 months my district manager offered me a promotion to shift supervisor. The catch was that I would have to transfer to a different store across town, a higher volume location in a commercial district that served the morning rush of office workers and attorneys who treated their coffee orders like legal briefs. I accepted without hesitation. My first day at the new location was a Monday in March. The store manager, a woman named Carolyn who wore her hair in a severe bun and spoke in the clipped cadence of someone permanently managing a crisis, gave me a walkthrough. She showed me the storage room, the safe, the cleaning protocols, and then she led me to the front counter and introduced me to the morning crew. "This is Diane," Carolyn said, gesturing toward a woman stationed at the espresso bar. "She is our strongest barista. She owns the morning rush. You will want to learn from her." Diane was in her mid-30s, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair pulled back tight enough to stretch the skin at her temples. She had a face that might have been attractive if any warmth had ever passed through it. I smiled and extended my hand. "Hey, I am Jordan. Really looking forward to working with you." Diane did not take my hand. She did not look at my hand. She looked at my face for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for me to register that her eyes were the flat, depthless brown of river stones, and then she made a sound in her throat that was not a word, turned her back, and walked away. I stood there with my hand out like an idiot. Carolyn laughed and waved it off. "Oh, she is just intense. She gets in the zone during morning rush. You will see." I wanted to believe that. I spent the entire first week telling myself that Diane was simply focused, perhaps socially awkward, perhaps having personal problems that made it difficult to engage with a stranger. Everyone has bad weeks. I have had enough of them myself to extend that grace without hesitation. But by the second week, I understood that this was not a bad week. This was personal. This was targeted. And it was relentless. Working in a coffee shop requires constant verbal coordination. You call out drink orders. You announce when you are stepping away from the bar. You confirm modifications. You communicate restocks. The entire operation depends on voices moving faster than hands. Diane refused to participate in any communication that involved me. If I asked her to grab a gallon of 2% from the walk-in cooler, she would continue steaming milk as though I had not spoken. If I informed her that a customer had changed their order from a latte to a cappuccino, she would make the latte anyway and slide it across the counter with a smirk. If I called out a drink and she was the one assembling it, she would wait until I finished speaking and then make something entirely different. The customers noticed before I did. Orders started coming back wrong 3 and 4 times a shift. A woman with a dairy allergy received whole milk in her drink and had a reaction in the parking lot. A regular who ordered the same thing every morning for 2 years stopped coming in entirely and later left a review online that mentioned the angry barista who acts like you are ruining her day by existing. It was my name on the shift report. It was my responsibility, my numbers, my problem. I tried to address it directly. After a particularly brutal 4-hour stretch during which Diane ignored every word I said and deliberately made 7 drinks incorrectly, I waited until we clocked out and caught her at the back door. I kept my voice calm and my posture open, textbook conflict resolution, the way they trained us in the onboarding modules. Diane, I wanted to clear the air. If I have done something to offend you, I genuinely apologize. I want us to have a good working relationship. We are on the same team. She stopped. She turned her head toward me with the slow, mechanical rotation of a surveillance camera. Her eyes were very wide and completely empty. And then she opened her mouth and screamed. Not a shriek of surprise, not a gasp. A scream. A sustained, full-throated, operatic scream of raw fury, directed at my face from a distance of approximately 2 feet. It was so loud that my ears rang afterward. It was so sudden that I stumbled backward and hit the wall. She held the scream for what felt like 10 seconds, but was probably 3, and then she slammed her palm against the emergency exit bar and stormed out into the parking lot, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with my heart trying to escape through my ribcage. The next day, I pulled aside a coworker named Marcus, one of the few people at the store who seemed willing to talk to me honestly. I asked him what Diane's problem was. He looked around the store like a man checking for snipers, leaned in and whispered, "Diane has been here for 4 years. Carolyn treats her like family, like a daughter, basically. When the shift supervisor position opened up, Diane assumed it was hers. She had seniority, she had Carolyn backing her, and she had been doing half the supervisory work already without the title or the pay. Then the district manager brought you in from outside, and Diane found out the same day you showed up. She thinks you stole her promotion. I felt a pang of sympathy. I understood that kind of frustration. I had been passed over before, and it burns in a way that is difficult to articulate to anyone who has not experienced it. For about 48 hours, I tried to channel that empathy into patience. But empathy has a shelf life, and Diane was determined to make sure mine expired quickly. Over the following months, Diane's behavior escalated from passive hostility to something that felt increasingly dangerous. She would berate customers who took too long to order. She would snap at elderly patrons who asked her to repeat the menu. She would slam cups down on the handoff counter hard enough to slosh liquid over the rim, and then laugh about it afterward. They love it when you are real with them, she would say. People respect honesty, but the customers did not love it. They came to me in quiet voices and said things like, "I am so glad she is not taking my order today," and "Is she always like that?" and "She genuinely frightens me." I documented everything. I carried a small notebook in my apron pocket, and after each incident I stepped into the bathroom and wrote down the date, the time, what happened, and who witnessed it. I filled 14 pages in 2 months, but the documentation felt like armor made of paper when I was alone with her. One night we were closing the store together, just the 2 of us, as the schedule often arranged because Carolyn trusted Diane with closing duties, and I was the supervisor on shift. The front doors were locked, the dining room lights were dimmed. The only illumination came from the fluorescent tubes behind the counter and the glow of the equipment displays. I was in the back office counting the register drawer and preparing the deposit. The store was quiet except for the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic. Then I heard a sharp crack from the front of the store, the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. I ran out. Diane was standing in the middle of the floor. A glass coffee carafe lay shattered at her feet, the fragments scattered across the tile in a starburst pattern. She was not bending down to clean it. She was not reaching for the broom. She was standing perfectly still, staring at the broken glass with an expression of such intense concentration that it looked almost meditative. She was holding a box cutter. The blade was extended, and she was clicking it in and out with her thumb. Click, click, click. A slow, rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up. She did not startle. She did not flinch. She just rotated her gaze toward me the way a turret rotates toward a target, smooth and unhurried and utterly mechanical. "Just an accident," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. A recorded message played into an empty room. She did not move. She did not put the box cutter down. She just stood there in the middle of the broken glass, clicking the blade in and out, watching me. I grabbed the broom myself. I swept the glass with my back pressed against the counter the entire time so that she could not get behind me. I did not finish the cash count that night. I threw the bills into the safe uncounted, and I left the store 20 minutes ahead of schedule. I sat in my car in the parking lot with the doors locked and my hands shaking on the steering wheel for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. 3 days later, Diane stopped pretending. It was a Tuesday morning, peak rush. The line was out the door and every station was running at full capacity. Diane was on bar and I was expediting, calling orders and managing the flow. I noticed that she had stopped announcing drinks. Customers were clustering at the handoff counter, confused, picking up wrong orders, asking each other whose drink was whose. The system was breaking down. I walked over to her station and spoke clearly but calmly, the way the training manual prescribed. "Diane, I need you to call out the drinks as you finish them so customers can hear. This is standard protocol, same expectation for everyone, including me." She stopped moving. She set down the milk pitcher with exaggerated slowness, placing it on the counter the way someone places an object they are deciding whether to throw. She turned toward me. Diane was taller than me by 4 or 5 inches, and heavier by at least 40 pounds. She had the build of someone who had done manual labor her entire life, thick forearms and wide shoulders and a low center of gravity that made her look immovable. When she turned, her face was a dark, mottled red, the flush starting at her chest and climbing up her neck and spreading across her cheeks like a stain. The veins in her temples were visible, pulsing. She lunged, not stepped, not leaned, lunged. She threw her entire body weight forward like a lineman hitting a tackling dummy, and I stumbled backward so fast that my lower back slammed into the edge of the counter with a force that sent a bolt of white pain up my spine. She kept coming. She pressed forward until her face was inches from mine, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, close enough that I could see every individual pore on her nose, and she said in a voice that was half whisper and half growl, "Back off. I am serious. You do not want to see what I am capable of." I raised my hands, palms open, and I did not say a single word. I slid sideways along the counter until I was out of her reach, and then I walked to the back room and closed the door and sat down on a milk crate and tried to breathe. My legs were shaking so badly that standing was not an option. My lower back throbbed where the counter had caught it. Through the door, I could hear the noise of the morning rush continuing, as though nothing had happened. I called Carolyn immediately. I told her everything, the lunge, the threat, the words. I expected termination, at minimum a suspension. Diane had physically threatened a supervisor in front of customers. This was not a gray area. This was a fireable offense in any employee handbook ever written. Carolyn listened. Then she said, in a tone of voice that contained all the warmth of a January sidewalk, "Look, Diane is the best barista in the district. She holds the morning rush together. She has been here 4 years. You need to learn how to work with her personality." I stared at the wall. She physically came at me. She threatened me. "You are telling me to just deal with it?" "I am telling you not to create a situation that makes things worse for everyone." I hung up the phone and sat in the back room for a very long time. I understood then, with the clarity that only comes from complete abandonment, that if something happened to me in that store, Carolyn would cover for Diane. She would rewrite the narrative. She would adjust the camera footage. She would tell the district manager that I was the problem, that I had provoked a valued team member, that the situation had been handled. I was disposable. Diane was essential. I called my former manager from the university store. She was the only person in the company I trusted. She told me to document every incident with dates, times, and witnesses. She told me to remove emotion from the report. She told me to go directly to the district manager with a formal complaint and a paper trail. I spent 2 weeks building my case. I carried the notebook everywhere. I wrote down every confrontation, every customer complaint, every instance of deliberate sabotage. I noted the witnesses by name. I noted Carolyn's response each time I reported an incident. When I had 23 pages of documentation, I requested a formal meeting with Carolyn and the district manager, a man named Brian, whose signature appeared on every memo and whose face appeared on none. Carolyn looked nervous when I told her. "Fine," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Come in tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We will hear you out." I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what I would say, organizing my evidence into a chronological narrative that no reasonable person could dismiss. I arrived at the store at 1:55. As I walked through the back hallway toward the office, the door opened and Diane walked out. She was not crying. She was not carrying a termination notice. She was smiling. It was the first genuine smile I had ever seen on her face, and it was the most unsettling expression I had ever encountered on a human being. It was the smile of someone who has just won a game that the other player does not yet know is over. She looked at me as she passed. She did not say a word. She just smiled that awful, triumphant smile and walked away toward the front of the store. I entered the office. Carolyn was behind the desk. Brian was in a folding chair, his legs crossed, his expression carefully neutral. I placed my notebook on the desk and said, "I have everything documented. The threats, the physical aggression, the customer complaints, the deliberate operational sabotage." Brian did not touch the notebook. He raised one hand, palm outward, and said in a voice that was polished smooth by years of corporate practice, "We are not interested in reviewing that. We have already heard from Diane today, and we have a clear picture of what has been happening in this store. Frankly, Jordan, we do not think this position is the right fit for you." I looked at the notebook. I looked at Brian. I looked at Carolyn, who was studying her fingernails as though they contained the secrets of the universe. They had decided before I walked in. Diane had met with them first, and whatever she had said, whatever version of events she had constructed, it had been accepted as the definitive account. My 23 pages of dates and times and witnesses were irrelevant. The verdict was already in. I did not argue. I did not shout. I picked up my notebook and I walked out the back door and I drove home and I sat in my car in my driveway for 45 minutes, staring through the windshield at nothing. The next morning I applied to graduate school. I was accepted within the semester, and I left that city and that industry and everything associated with it behind me like a burning building. 18 months later, I was scrolling through social media when a post from a mutual acquaintance stopped me mid-swipe. It was a photograph of Diane. She was wearing a freshly pressed police uniform, standing beside a cruiser with a department badge on her chest and a service weapon on her hip. She was smiling that same smile. The caption read, "So proud of our girl, sworn in today, Diane, the woman who screamed in my face, the woman who lunged at me behind a counter, the woman who stood in a dark room, clicking a box cutter blade in and out while staring at broken glass with the focus of a surgeon. That woman now carries a badge and a firearm and the legal authority of the state." I closed my phone and set it face down on the table and did not pick it up again for 2 days. Some nights I lie awake and think about the people who will encounter her now, the people who will be pulled over on empty roads at 2 in the morning, the people who will call for help and see her face arrive at the door. I think about whether she still simmers, whether she still memorizes the layout of the room, whether there is anyone documenting her now. And then I stop thinking about it, because the answer to that last question, the one that matters most, is almost certainly no. I am going to tell you about a man I worked with named Gerald Pitts, and I am going to tell you about the day he disappeared, and I need you to understand that even now, more than a decade later, I have never driven down that stretch of road after dark without checking my rear view mirror every 15 seconds. Gerald was a project coordinator at a mid-size engineering consultancy in a town I will not name, somewhere in the kind of American heartland where the commute takes you through 20 minutes of uninterrupted forest and the cell service drops to nothing between the office park and the first traffic light. He had been with the company for 11 years. 11 years. He was the kind of employee who treated punctuality as a moral imperative and considered sick days a sign of weak character. He arrived before the lights were on and left after the cleaning crew. He knew every regulation, every filing code, every clause of every contract the company had signed since the Clinton administration. He was also, and I say this with the resigned affection of someone who endured him for 7 of those 11 years, the most relentlessly insufferable human being I have ever encountered in a professional setting. Gerald believed that his title, Project Coordinator, conferred upon him the authority of a 4-star general. He patrolled the office the way a prison guard patrols a cell block, walking every hallway at irregular intervals, peering into every cubicle, checking every desk for signs of absence or inactivity. If you stepped away from your workstation for more than 5 minutes, for any reason, whether it was to use the restroom, or take a phone call from your child's school, or simply stretch your legs after 3 hours of staring at spreadsheets, Gerald would be standing beside your chair when you returned. He would look at his watch, he would look at you, and he would say, with the self-righteous gravity of a man delivering a sentencing statement, "That was 7 minutes. Company time is not your time." He reported these perceived infractions to your actual supervisor, to your supervisor's supervisor, and occasionally to the company owner, a mild-mannered man named Phil, who had long since given up trying to rein Gerald in and had settled for apologizing on his behalf. Gerald had no direct reports. He had no supervisory authority. He had no disciplinary power whatsoever. But he had convinced himself, through some baroque internal logic that I never fully understood, that he was the moral custodian of the entire organization, and he performed this self-appointed role with the fervor of a medieval inquisitor. I started tracking him, not out of malice, out of self-defense, and, if I am being honest, because it amused me during the long stretches of tedium that define office life. I kept a small whiteboard in my cubicle, and every time Gerald walked past on one of his patrols, I made a tick mark. At the end of each month, I transferred the data to a spreadsheet on my phone. I created charts, bar graphs, heat maps showing peak patrol times. I identified patterns. Gerald increased his rounds on Mondays and Fridays, presumably because he believed people were more likely to slack off at the beginning and end of the work week. He reduced his patrols during the 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. window, which I theorized was because he was eating lunch at his desk while reading trade journals, though several colleagues maintained it was because he was napping. I kept this spreadsheet for 4 years. It became the office's longest-running joke. People would stop by my cubicle on their way to the break room and ask for the latest numbers. "What is the Gerald index today?" someone would whisper, and I would hold up 3 fingers, meaning he had already made 3 passes by 10:30. We gave him a nickname. We called him the Warden. None of us were laughing when the company hired a man named Dale. Dale arrived on a Wednesday in September. He was a new hire for the drafting department, brought on to handle overflow from a large municipal contract. He was quiet in a way that made the air around him feel heavier, not shy, not reserved. Quiet the way a closed door is quiet, the way a room you have never entered is quiet. He did not introduce himself to anyone. He did not eat in the break room. He sat at his workstation with his back pressed flat against the wall and his monitor angled so that no one could see his screen, and he worked in absolute silence for 8 hours, and then he left. I noticed him the way you notice a shadow that should not be there. He was unremarkable in every physical sense. Average height, average build, brown hair cut short, no distinguishing features, the kind of face that security cameras forget. But there was something about his stillness that felt rehearsed, as though he was performing the role of an ordinary office worker the way an actor performs a role, hitting every mark but never quite inhabiting the character. He had been with the company for 3 weeks when it happened. Dale stood up from his desk at approximately 2:15 on a Friday afternoon. He walked toward the back of the office, presumably to use the restroom or make a phone call. He was gone for perhaps 12 minutes. 12 minutes. In any reasonable workplace, this would not merit a footnote. But Gerald had been on patrol. Gerald had passed Dale's empty desk at 2:18, noted the absence, checked his watch, and positioned himself beside Dale's cubicle like a sentry awaiting a deserter. When Dale returned, Gerald was in his face before he could sit down. I was in the adjacent cubicle, and I heard every word with perfect clarity, because Gerald, as was his custom, conducted these confrontations at a volume that ensured the entire floor could appreciate his righteousness. 12 minutes. 12 minutes of company time. Where were you? What possible reason could you have for being away from your workstation for 12 minutes? I have been timing you. Dale looked at him. He did not blink. He did not shift his weight. He stood with his arms at his sides and his head slightly tilted, the way a dog tilts its head when it hears a frequency that humans cannot perceive. You should sit down, Dale said. His voice was so quiet that I had to lean sideways in my chair to catch the words. Gerald laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh, the kind that is meant to communicate dominance rather than amusement. You do not tell me what to do. I am reporting this to management. Pack your things. Gerald did not have the authority to fire anyone. He had never had the authority to fire anyone. But he had been making this threat for so long, and with such conviction, that most people simply complied rather than endure the argument. Most people packed their things and went to HR and sorted it out later. Dale did not pack his things. He leaned in. He leaned in close enough that I could have reached out and touched both of them. And he spoke in a whisper that carried the weight of a dropped hammer. If you do this, I will kill you. I will kill you, and I will kill everyone you care about. Do you understand me? He did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He delivered these words with the flat, factual tone of a man reading a weather forecast, and that was what made them so terrifying. There was no heat in them, no anger, no bluster, just a calm, clinical statement of intent, as emotionless as a blueprint. Gerald rolled his eyes. He actually rolled his eyes. He pointed at the door and said, "Get out before I call security." Dale straightened up. He looked at Gerald for a long moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, and in that silence, something passed between them that I still cannot articulate. Then Dale turned and walked out of the office without looking back. He did not take anything from his desk. He did not speak to anyone. He walked through the front door and into the parking lot, and we watched him through the window as he got into a nondescript gray sedan and drove away. Gerald spent the rest of the afternoon telling everyone what had happened, embellishing the story with each retelling until he had transformed himself from a petty bully harassing a quiet employee into a courageous defender of corporate integrity who had single-handedly identified and expelled a dangerous individual. By 5 o'clock, he was practically taking a victory lap around the office. At 5:30, Gerald got in his car and drove home. It was a Friday evening. The weekend stretched ahead like a guarantee. On Monday morning, Gerald's desk was empty. This was unprecedented. In 11 years, Gerald Pitts had never missed a day of work. He had come to the office with a fever of 102. He had come in during a blizzard that closed schools and government buildings. He had come in the day after his mother's funeral, red-eyed and silent but present, always present, because to Gerald, absence was failure, and failure was unforgivable. By Tuesday, no one had heard from him. Phil, the company owner, called Gerald's cell phone repeatedly and received nothing but a dead line. He called Gerald's home phone, and it rang until the voicemail box, which was full, cut him off. Phil drove to Gerald's house that afternoon. The house was locked. The blinds were drawn. 3 days of mail protruded from the mailbox, and the Wednesday newspaper was still in its plastic sleeve on the front porch. Phil knocked for 10 minutes. No one answered. By Wednesday afternoon, Phil involved the police. 2 officers came to the office and took statements. They drove to Gerald's house, and when no one answered, they contacted the landlord and entered with a key. The house was empty. Gerald's wallet was on the kitchen counter. His phone was on the charger in the bedroom, dead. His suitcase was in the closet. His toothbrush was in the holder above the bathroom sink. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. It looked exactly like the home of a man who had stepped out to check the mail and never came back. The police traced Gerald's commute. His daily route took him along a 2-lane county road that cut through 6 miles of dense forest, the kind of road where the canopy closes overhead like a tunnel, and the only light comes from your own headlights reflecting off the asphalt. There were no streetlights. There were no houses. There were no turnoffs, except for an overgrown fire road that the county had stopped maintaining years ago. They found Gerald's car a 1/4 mile down that fire road. It had been driven off the pavement and into a thicket of mountain laurel, so dense that you could not see the vehicle from the road, even in broad daylight. The driver's side door was open. The keys were in the ignition. The engine was off. On the road itself, approximately 200 yards before the fire road turnoff, the police found a fallen tree trunk lying across both lanes. It had not fallen naturally. The cut marks on the base were clean and precise, made by a chainsaw. Someone had dropped that tree deliberately, at a specific location at a specific time, to force a specific car to stop. And in the gravel shoulder near the tree, they found a line of roofing nails scattered across the road surface. Gerald's front tires were both flat. The police searched the surrounding forest for a week. They brought tracking dogs. They brought a helicopter. They walked grid patterns through the undergrowth and checked every hunting cabin and abandoned structure within a 5-mile radius. They found nothing. Then they went back to the office and pulled Dale's employment file, and that is when the situation became something else entirely. Dale's file listed a home address on Birchwood Lane. The police drove to Birchwood Lane. There was no house at that address. There was no building of any kind. The lot was an empty rectangle of weeds and gravel between a foreclosed duplex and a vacant commercial property. It had been empty for 6 years. They ran Dale's Social Security number through the federal database. The number was unassigned. It had never been issued to any person. They ran his driver's license number. It belonged to a man who had died in a car accident in another state 8 years prior. They searched for Dale's name in every available database, every public record, every law enforcement system in the country. Dale did not exist. He had never existed. The man who sat 3 cubicles away from me for 3 weeks, who used our bathroom and drank our coffee and breathed our recycled office air, was a fiction. A carefully constructed identity wrapped around a person whose real name we did not know and whose real history we could not imagine. The realization hit our office like a slow-motion car crash. For days, nobody spoke above a whisper. People double-checked the locks on their cars. People started leaving in groups. The woman who sat on the other side of Dale's cubicle, a technical writer named Rochelle, took a week of medical leave and came back with dark circles under her eyes that never fully faded. We all asked ourselves the same question, and it was not, what happened to Gerald? We knew, or at least suspected, what had happened to Gerald. The question that kept us awake, the question that burrowed into our thoughts like a splinter, was, who was sitting next to me? 2 weeks after Gerald's disappearance, on a Saturday morning, I was at the grocery store. I remember the specific aisle because I remember the specific mundanity of the moment. The absurd normalcy of a man standing in the pasta sauce aisle on a Saturday morning in a town where a coworker had recently vanished into thin air. I was reaching for a jar of marinara when I looked up and my blood turned to ice water. Dale was standing at the end of the aisle. He was wearing a baseball cap and dark glasses, but I recognized him immediately. The posture, the stillness, the way he held his body like a weapon in a holster, relaxed but ready. He was putting canned goods into a basket with the unhurried deliberation of a man who has nowhere to be and all the time in the world. My hands were sweating so badly that the jar almost slipped from my fingers. I set it back on the shelf. I left my cart in the middle of the aisle. I walked, did not run because running draws attention, and attention was the last thing I wanted from that man, toward the back of the store. I found a stockroom door that was propped open, and I slipped through it and crouched behind a pallet of bottled water and pulled out my phone with hands that were shaking so badly I had to use both thumbs to dial. I called Phil. My voice cracked when I spoke, and I did not care. He is here, the man who threatened Gerald. He is in the grocery store on Fifth Avenue right now. I am looking at him. Phil called the police. I stayed hidden behind that pallet for what felt like an hour, but was probably 8 minutes. I heard the electronic chime of the front entrance opening and closing and opening again, and then the sound of raised voices near the checkout lanes. I crept to the stockroom door and peered through the crack. 4 officers had Dale near the exit. He had tried to walk out the front door with his groceries, as though nothing was unusual, and they had intercepted him between the register and the automatic doors. He did not resist at first. He set his basket down gently, almost politely, and then he bolted. He made it 6 steps before 2 officers brought him down. They cuffed him on the floor of the vestibule, while a stock clerk stood frozen with a pricing gun in his hand, mouth open, watching the scene unfold like a man watching a nature documentary come to life. The police transported Dale, or whatever his real name was, to the county jail and began the interrogation. And over the following days, the story that emerged was worse than any of us had imagined. On that Friday evening, Gerald had been driving home along the dark county road as he did every night. As he rounded the curve where the fire road intersected the main highway, his headlights illuminated a fallen tree blocking both lanes. He braked. He felt the tires deflate beneath him as the nails did their work. He got out of the car to assess the damage, and as he stood in the road looking at his flattened tires, Dale emerged from the tree line 20 feet away. He was carrying a hunting rifle, and he was not alone. Dale had a partner, a man whose identity the police also struggled to verify, a man who seemed to exist in the same shadow world of fabricated documents and hollow identities. Together they forced Gerald into the back seat of his own car. Dale drove the car off the road and into the laurel thicket. His partner followed on foot, sweeping the tire tracks with a branch. They took Gerald into the forest, 2 miles in, down a ravine that no casual hiker would ever descend. There was a rock overhang that formed a shallow cave, invisible from more than 10 feet away, and accessible only through a gap in the brush that looked like solid undergrowth to anyone passing by. They had prepared this location in advance. There were supplies stashed inside: water, canned food, a kerosene lantern, zip ties, duct tape. They kept Gerald in that cave for 16 days. The reason he was still alive after 16 days was not mercy, it was disagreement. Dale wanted to kill him. Dale had planned to kill him from the moment Gerald pointed at the door and told him to leave. The threat in the office had not been bluster. It had been a promise, delivered with the same dispassionate precision with which Dale seemed to do everything. But Dale's partner had a different agenda. The partner wanted money. He had researched Gerald's family and discovered that Gerald's brother was a moderately successful real estate developer with liquid assets. The partner wanted to contact the brother and demand a ransom. Dale considered this unnecessary and dangerous. The partner considered it profitable and worth the risk. They argued about it for 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which Gerald Pitts sat in a cave in the dark, bound and gagged and listening to two men debate the method and timing of his death with the detached pragmatism of contractors discussing a construction schedule. Dale had grown tired of waiting. According to the police interrogation, Dale had decided to end the situation that weekend, the weekend I saw him in the grocery store. He had come into town to buy supplies, not food for Gerald, supplies for disposal. He was buying provisions for himself because the task he had planned would take several hours, and he intended to eat afterward. If I had not looked up from the pasta sauce at that exact moment, if I had been in a different aisle or arrived 5 minutes later, Dale would have driven back to the forest that afternoon, and Gerald Pitts would have died in a cave that no one knew existed. The police raided the cave site within hours of Dale's arrest. They found Gerald in severe condition, dehydrated and disoriented and suffering from exposure, but alive. They found the partner asleep beside the cave entrance and took him into custody without a struggle. Gerald Pitts never returned to work. He never returned to the office or the town or, as far as I know, to any kind of professional environment. I heard through the small town network that sustains itself on exactly this kind of information that he sold his house, moved out of state, and took a job that did not require him to supervise anyone ever again. I still work at the same company. I still sit in the same cubicle. I still drive the same stretch of road between the office and the first traffic light. But I do not drive it the same way. I check my mirrors. I watch the tree line. I scan the shoulder for anything that should not be there. A glint of metal, a shape that does not belong. The outline of a man standing very still in the shadows between the trunks. And sometimes, late in the afternoon when the office is quiet and the only sound is the hum of the ventilation system, I look at the empty desk where Dale used to sit and I think about how easy it was, how effortless. A fake name, a fake address, a fake number. 3 weeks of silence and a calm voice and a face that cameras forget. That is all it took to sit among us, to breathe our air, to study our patterns, and to wait. That is the part that stays with me. Not the cave, not the rifle, not the nails in the road. The waiting, the patience, the absolute inhuman discipline of a predator who walks into a room full of prey and simply sits down and watches until he knows exactly when and how to strike. I still have the spreadsheet. 4 years of Gerald's patrol data, meticulously recorded, charted, and color-coded. I look at it sometimes. It used to make me laugh. Now it just makes me think about how little any of us truly know about the people we spend our lives beside, and how the most dangerous thing in any room is not the person who makes the most noise. It is the one who makes none at all.